Shenhe is finally out, and this is an honest look at how she works with different teams and characters. So here's exactly what you need to know about her in this showcase video. This unexpected Chongyun's auntie is the newest 5-star Cryo character who focuses on supporting her own element, and it's for the first time we see a 5-star that has a very specific purpose, so I think it's best to start this video by figuring out just how good is her overall design at Constellation 0. Now her main source of damage is the elemental skill, which works in a really complicated way, so its full explanation will be available in her future guide video, and instead, all you basically need to know right now is that after pressing or holding down her elemental skill, everyone in the party, including herself, will gain 5 or 7 ice equal stacks respectively that will get consumed on each hit, which means every enemy hit counts as consuming the stack. And to add on top of this isn't your regular attack buff, but instead, I call it a damage buff because the character who consumes the ice equal will only be able to increase its potential further with their critical damage stat and bonus cryo elemental damage they have, as well as taking enemies' defense and cryo resistance into consideration, or if it just so happens Shenhe manages to gain an additional buff to her attack, then this in return will also make her ice equals stronger. So with all of this out of the way, the basic premise of how Shenhe works is that she uses her burst as a way to weaken enemies' cryo as well as physical resistance, and along with her passive talent, improve the party's cryo damage, while the elemental skill acts like an ammunition that you want to unload as fast as possible. For example, if the team comp is made up of Ganyu, Rosaria, Shenhe, and Kazuha, and you tap the elemental skill, you essentially now have 20 ice equals in total, 5 per each party member, and you need to unload all within the next 10 seconds before the buff expires. Now there's a lot of ways how you can approach this team comp rotation, but here's the fun part. Everything that has to do with ice equals damage happens dynamically, meaning let's say you drop Rosaria's elemental burst and it continues doing its regular damage, but if midway you decide to tap Shenhe's elemental skill, immediately afterwards Rosaria's burst will now start consuming the 5 ice equals stacks, and if let's say there are 3 enemies around burst radius, it only takes 2 pulses to use up all of the stacks. Also, here's another really interesting thing about the ice equals. While you cannot consume the stacks if you do something like Cryo Swirl reaction, you can in fact trigger the stacks when a skill or burst has elemental absorption in its description, which means Kazuha's skill and burst will consume the stacks, while Venti and Sucrose will also be able to do this, but only with their bursts. What this basically means is that Animo characters are able to use Shenhe's ice equals as long as they infuse their abilities with Cryo through elemental absorption, and that's awesome because now you're not just limited to Cryo characters. Finally, I kind of lied to you a little about the initial ice equals stack, because it just so happens that if Shenhe manages to hit the enemy with her elemental skill, it will always immediately consume the stack, meaning the damage you see here is already powered up with her ice equal, and if I for example hit 3 enemies by holding down her skill, she only has 4 stacks left, and you can see for yourself when looking at this burst example afterwards. Basically, when it comes to her elemental skill, I hope it's clear enough just how complex but at the same time flexible Shenhe is. And this is without considering her both passive talents that further enhance the damage, but I think the best way to see for yourself what I mean is by taking a look at some of the team comps with her. The build I will be using here isn't exactly groundbreaking because this is miHoYo's content creator server, but after spending some time in the domains, I ended up with, in my opinion, average results, but I do believe this should suffice it in order to get a good look at her overall performance. In fact, getting good artifacts on her isn't that big of a deal, and it's her weapon choices that play a huge part for her support build, so for the first few showcases, I will be comparing 2 weapons, which is the newest Calamity Queller along with Favonius Lance, and ironically enough, the former is the best option for her overall attack, while the latter provides almost 26% less attack, but in exchange, you are getting energy recharge, which I'll get back to it later. Also, keep in mind this is a level 90 Shenhe with all talents set to level 9. Since Shenhe's playstyle is all about boosting cryo damage, it only makes sense to first find out how well this works on different cryo characters, right? And because I've already explained how unique her damage buff is, you can easily spot the difference when using her ice equals with someone like Diona, who deals almost non-existent cryo damage as a support, but here, if she has those 5 or 7 ice equals loaded up, suddenly she can unleash decent amount of damage. So the most important thing about making making all of this work is how fast and how many enemies can you hit with a cryo attack, because there's only 10 or 15 seconds you have before the buff runs out, and you want to cycle through every possible party member to do this. So the first comp tested on the final floor of the Abyss was Ganyu, Shenhe, Venti, and Kokomi, because in the second chamber, you can't really freeze the triple Mago Kenki, and good luck dodging their attacks. So to keep the team alive, Kokomi was utilized for healing. The results were fine for the most part, since how it usually went was opening up with Shenhe's health skill and burst, then immediately switching to Ganyu's burst and skill, followed by Venti's skill and burst, and then Kokomi's jellyfish to start freezing and healing, and afterwards, circling back to Ganyu or Shenhe, depending on how much time was left waiting for the cooldowns to refresh. I'm not gonna lie, pulling this off is pretty satisfying, but with only 125% energy recharged I managed to get from substats, and triple attack from Sans, Goblet, and Circlet, it was hard to maintain Shenhe's burst off cooldown, especially if you're using Calamity Queller, so it feels like she needs more energy recharge to keep the burst active at all times, and since it is the main way of how you can actually use up all of her Icy Quill stacks, not to mention the utility her burst provides for further cryo damage, going with more AR only made sense, which is why afterwards I went from attack to energy recharge Sans, increasing it to around 180%. And immediately, I would notice an improvement. Even if it meant losing out on bigger damage buff she could provide with her skill, I still think keeping her burst on the field is really important if we want to take advantage of her full kit. Afterwards, the other team tested was Ayaka, Shenhe, Kazuha, and Mona, which is an extremely dangerous option against anyone who cannot be frozen, but unloading her quills with Kazuha and Ayaka is really easy. Not to mention Mona's Omen buff only makes things more deadly, but if needed, you can change her to either Barbara, Xingqiu, or Kokomi for that extra survivability. However, this next team is where I got the most surprising results. Mono Cryo with Shenhe and Kazuha. I did not expect to see her quills work so well, and in fact, the damage output was way more better than using her in a freeze comp, but obviously, this is not my main account, and the artifacts are average at best, and yet, the amount of damage you can dish out with all 20 or 28 stacks if you press or hold down the button is pretty insane, provided you can keep the enemies grouped up. But the cool thing about it is that when going up against single target bosses, you can immediately notice just how much of an impact her whole kit has on everyone who deals cryo damage. And what's even better, because of triple cryo, you can switch back to attack Sans on Shenhe, a choice that can be easily made if you use Diona with Sacrificial Bow, who will also act as the shielder and healer for the team. Now obviously, this team's performance heavily depends if you can fully unload all of the Icy Quill stacks, which is why I mentioned previously that they dynamically get added into anyone's deployed burst or skill, and I think because of this, it's easier to unload all of the Icy Quills, especially since a stack gets removed per enemy hit, so it doesn't take much to get rid of all of them when there's a lot of enemies in range. Finally, reverse build Ganyu and Rosaria variations were tested, but I didn't see that much of a huge difference, and maybe with more time, better results can be found, but so far, it seems you really want to have at least 3 characters with flexible bursts and skills unloading those quills as fast as possible, and more importantly, having an Anemo character who can shred away the cryo resistance results in better overall performance. Look, I'll be honest, I think miHoYo could have been a bit more generous when it comes to making certain things about Shenhe better. Like for example, her burst radius is so much smaller when compared to Ganyu's, and since you want to keep fighting inside of it so that enemies take more damage from cryo, while at the same time, she does struggle quite a lot with energy at C0, especially in freeze teams, so you'll need to use either Favonius Lance or Energy Recharge Sans to make up for it, and I think it's obvious by now why her first constellation literally lets you use the skill once again, which means you can get a lot more particles for her and makes it easier at maintaining her burst and the overall damage boost she will provide. But I do love the fact her whole design revolves around at how efficient are you going to be with her Icy Quills, since the damage buff she provides can even be used with Anemo characters who can infuse the elements, and I was really surprised to see just how good she is in enabling mono cryo teams, especially if it was done with Kazuha. And I think that the biggest takeaway here would be that her Icy Quills work exceptionally well if the character who's unloading them has really high critical damage and or cryo damage bonus, as well as the enemy who is receiving the damage has their resistance or defense reduced, because those are going to be the biggest factors in increasing the quill damage. Also, it's pretty clear by now, she is definitely an advanced unit that's not beginner friendly if you want to take full advantage of everything she has to offer, but at the same time, she's not that super hard to play around. Just activate her skill and burst and start unloading those quills with everyone else in the party, which I mean comes naturally since the plan is to use everyone's cooldowns anyway. Still, I think Shenhe will become quite relevant for cryo-centric teams, especially as more time passes and more cryo characters get added into the game. I hope you enjoyed this quick video showcasing Shenhe's build and some of the teams I've explored. I think there's still a lot more about her that I haven't covered, so look out for my future videos, which are going to be her full guide, and I will also come back with another review that compares her among other cryo support characters and what exactly she brings to the table. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you soon.